Leroy Nicky Barnes, who for 7 years in the 1970s was godfather of the largest and most profitable heroin-selling operation in the history of New York City. Barnes was arrested variously for homicide, bribery, drug dealing, and gun possession, but none of the charges stuck.
I was overwhelmed by guilt. I had every reason to testify against him and no reason at all to feel guilty.
You ever kill anybody?
No.
Had other people do it for you?
I guess that would best describe it, yeah. Yeah.
Before people even started throwing around the term drug lord, Harlem had already crowned one of its own, Nicky Barnes. In the chaos of 1970s New York, when crime, drugs, and corruption were everywhere, Barnes carved out his kingdom, building a empire of staggering size and reach.
Leroy Nicky Barnes was perhaps Harlem's and one of the country's biggest drug dealers. He sported the fur coats and fancy cars that marked his success.
On the streets, he was untouchable. To law enforcement, he was a ghost. 13 arrests, 13 escapes. That reputation made him a legend, but it also put a huge target on his back. And when the fall came, it came hard. Let's get into it. Leroy Nicholas Barnes came into the world on October 15, 1933. Harlem at that time was still reeling from the aftershocks of the Great Depression, a neighborhood where opportunity was thin and poverty was heavy in the air. For Barnes, home wasn't a refuge from that pressure. It was its own battlefield. His father was an alcoholic, a sharp dresser who always had a flask in one hand and a fresh suit on his back, but never any money for rent or food. But what left a deeper mark were the beatings. His father hit his mother. He hit Nicky. Years later, when he was asked where his generation learned to settle problems with fists, guns, and knives, Barnes didn't hesitate. Maybe we learned it at home. The streets became his escape, and by the time he was just 9 or 10, he'd already caught his first arrest. Barnes was shining shoes with a friend when a drunk customer plopped down for a polish. The man pulled out a wallet stuffed with bills, more cash than Barnes had probably ever seen at once. Temptation won. He snatched it and ran, but he didn't get far. The cops picked him up. When his father found out, his reaction wasn't what you'd call guidance. Instead, it was more rage. More fists. That moment became a turning point. If home wasn't safe and the cops weren't forgiving, then the streets were the only option left. Barnes leaned into it. He joined a gang of local kids, and this wasn't stickball or marbles. They were fighting rival crews with homemade pistols. The same violence that lived in his household was now the way he navigated Harlem corners. One story, in particular, stuck with Barnes for life. He was maybe 12 or 13 when another fight broke out between his parents. His father swung at his mother, and this time Nicky stepped in. His father turned on him, and Barnes reached for one of those jerry-rigged guns the kids had been playing with. When he charged toward me, I pulled the zipper. And I fired, but the gun blew to pieces in my hand, he later recalled. The shot barely grazed his father's jacket, but the message was sent. Nicky wasn't going to be anyone's victim. From that point on, the relationship was broken beyond repair. Soon after, Barnes and his gang actually plotted to kill his father, lying in wait outside his job. They didn't go through with it, but the threats alone were enough. His father left the family not long after. By then, crime was becoming who he was. His first brush with the drug game started at home too. He found a bag of powder hidden away by his father, who was holding it for a dealer. Nicky skimmed some off the top and sold it on the street. Just like that, he was in the business. But there was another side to the story. Barnes wasn't just selling, he was using. By his teens, he was a full-blown addict, sometimes mixing in to feed the habit. He turned to car break-ins and petty hustles. Eventually, he got caught, and the courts handed him a 3.5-year prison sentence. He ended up serving 18 months before parole. Ironically, that stint in prison might have saved his life. Behind bars, Barnes managed to kick his addiction cold. No drugs, no needles, just discipline. And in the process, he made himself a promise. He would never use again, but he would sell. He understood addicts better than most because he had been one, and that gave him an edge. I was an addict. I knew what addicts wanted, he explained later. When he hit the streets again, Barnes had a new sense of direction. He organized a little crew of friends and started pulling robberies to build capital. He could be ruthless. One story tells how he forced an elderly woman to strip on the spot because her clothes were valuable enough to resell. And then came the break. A local dealer known as Fat Herbie noticed him. What impressed Herbie wasn't Barnes's muscle, but his style. Barnes didn't blow his money on getting high. He spent it on sharp suits and flashy clothes, always looking like he belonged in a higher class of hustlers. That flair caught Herbie's eye, and soon, Barnes was working as his courier. That job opened the door to the next level. Fat Herbie connected him to the Italians, the real suppliers, the men who controlled the pipeline into New York. Barnes soon found himself moving in the orbit of Frank Madonna and his fiery younger brother, Matthew "Matty" Madonna, both tied to the Lucchese crime family. But just as his star was starting to rise, bad luck struck. His wife's childhood friend turned out to be a police informant. The setup led to a raid on his apartment. No drugs were found, but there was enough cash and packaging material to get him a 5-year stretch. Then, in 1965, came the hammer. He was caught with $500,000 worth of heroin. The courts hit him hard. 15 to 20 years. When Leroy Nicky Barnes was sent upstate to Greenhaven State Prison in 1965, the state thought it was locking away a problem, but that wasn't what happened. What the system really did was send him to college. For Barnes, prison wasn't just punishment, it was education. He later called it a crime school, a place where the syllabus was hustling, the professors were mobsters, and the final exam was survival. One of the first professors he met was Matthew "Matty" Madonna. Matty wasn't some dime-a-dozen tough guy. He was Lucchese family, a real-deal wise guy, sitting on a 20-year sentence for murder. Barnes and Matty shouldn't have had much in common. One was a young black hustler from Harlem, the other a seasoned Italian mobster. But the two clicked. Matty saw potential in Nicky, so Matty gave him the game plan, the blueprint for running an organization without ever touching the dirt yourself. If you want to be protected from the powder, Matty schooled him, you gotta treat it like you're the Don. You want all the profits flowing up and all the risk flowing down. You need layers. Use captains, use capos. Let them handle the money and the pickups. Put the soldiers, the soldati, on the corners, in the trenches. You keep at least 3 levels between you and the dope. That way, you don't even have to touch it. You might end up with 50 people working under you, but you stay clean, you stay invisible. But Matty wasn't his only mentor. The other was even more infamous. Joseph "Crazy Joe" Gallo, a captain in the Colombo crime family. Gallo was the definition of unpredictable, brilliant, dangerous, rebellious. He had a reputation not just as a killer, but as a visionary. This was the man rumored to have pulled the trigger in one of the most legendary mob hits of all time, the barbershop execution of Albert Anastasia, the boss who once ran murder. Incan Gallo didn't just teach Nicky about violence, he taught him about the bigger picture. He told him straight up that the Italians weren't going to dominate Harlem's drug trade forever. The future, Gallo believed, belonged to black crews, to men like Barnes who could organize their neighborhoods in ways the mafia couldn't. And Gallo didn't just preach it, he lived it. In the prison yard, he backed up black inmates when other factions tried to press them. He was an outcast among his own people, but he and Barnes built a real friendship. Gallo schooled him on the mafia's inner workings, the 80-year-old bureaucracy that made it function like a government. He laid out the positions, the hierarchy, the checks and balances, everything Barnes would need to build his own machine in Harlem. Barnes wasn't just soaking up street wisdom though. He was also hitting the prison library hard. He became a voracious reader, not only burning through philosophy and literature, Sartre, Camus, but adopting Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince as his personal Bible. One lesson in particular stuck with him. There is no right or wrong, only power. Whoever has the guns, whoever enforces the rules, that's who decides what's right. He didn't stop there. He studied law, poring through legal journals, looking for ways to beat the system. According to some, It was Gallo who connected him with a sharp lawyer who found a procedural error that overturned his conviction in 1971. But Barnes himself always claimed credit. He said he was the one who found the key in a Supreme Court case, Katz versus United States, which ruled on the illegality of certain wiretaps. Whether it was his mind or Gallo's lawyer, the outcome was the same. The walls of Green Haven opened, and Barnes walked out a free man. When Nicky Barnes walked out of Green Haven in 1971, he didn't come out looking for a corner or scrambling to find a hustle. He came out with a strategy. The years inside had been his version of grad school, and now it was time to put that mafia M.B.A. to work. And just like any fresh graduate, he had his seed money ready, courtesy of his prison connection, Matty Madonna. Matty's brother, Frank Madonna, was waiting for him on the outside. He greeted him with an opportunity, half a kilo of on consignment, plus $2,000 in cash to buy a car and set up a stash spot. It was the underworld's version of a startup fund, and Barnes was about to turn it into something colossal. Barnes understood something a lot of hustlers didn't. Loners don't build empires. So his first move wasn't to get on the block, it was to recruit a team, but not just any crew. He wanted the sharpest minds, the best hustlers, the men who could be partners, not just soldiers. In 1972, he formalized it, the Council. Think of it as the black mafia of Harlem. 7 men sitting at the top, running the heroin trade like it was a board of directors. Barnes himself, of course, then Joseph Jazz Hayden, Wallace Rice, Thomas Gaps Foreman, Ishmael Muhammad, Frank James, and a smooth, charismatic protege more than a decade younger than Barnes, Guy Fisher. They weren't just associates. They acted like brothers. They even had a code, a 7-word oath that opened every meeting. Treat my brother as I treat myself.
Barnes testified about his secret 7-member drug council, composed of the most successful black dealers in New York.
The oath of brotherhood was 7 words. Treat my brother as I treat myself.
The system Barnes built was tight, efficient, and genius in its simplicity. With Matty Madonna and the Lucchese family supplying him, he had a direct line to pure, uncut. But instead of letting it trickle through multiple hands like the old way, he cut out the middlemen. He ran it top to bottom, buying wholesale from the Italians and distributing straight to the street. The way the handoffs went down was slick. Madonna's guys would park a car loaded with as much as 30 kilos of dope in the trunk. The key would get passed to Barnes. Barnes would send one of his men to scoop it. Once the heroin was flipped, the process reversed, Barnes would load a car with cash, park it, and hand Madonna the key. No one ever touched the money and the dope in the same deal. By 1976, what Barnes had built wasn't just a Harlem operation, it was a national empire. At the top sat the Council. Beneath them, 7 lieutenants. Each lieutenant controlled a dozen distributors, and each of those distributors supplied dozens of street dealers, a pyramid that stretched from New York into Pennsylvania, New Jersey, even as far west as Arizona, and north into Canada.
Leroy Nicky Barnes was perhaps Harlem's and one of the country's biggest drug dealers.
Leroy Nicky Barnes, who for 7 years in the 1970s was godfather of the largest and most profitable selling operation in the history of New York City.
The numbers were staggering. At its peak, the machine was moving around $100 million in a year. Barnes himself was pocketing over $25 million annually, with his net worth floating above $50 million. And Nicky lived like it. His lifestyle was louder than his legend. He became Harlem's folk hero, the face of what success looked like when the system said you'd never make it. He wasn't shy about showing it either. He owned between 200 and 300 custom-tailored suits, over 100 pairs of shoes made just for him, and 50 full-length leather coats. His jewelry collection alone was worth $7 million. His cars were the stuff of neighborhood myth. A Bentley, a Citroen with a Maserati engine, Maseratis, a Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, Cadillacs, Lincolns, even a yellow Volvo just because he could.
He became a Harlem legend and very rich. And whatever he had, he flaunted, be it women or Rolls Royces.
To keep it looking legit, he set up phony companies, car dealerships, and leasing businesses that rented him the vehicles. But everyone in Harlem knew those were his toys. He'd glide down 116th Street or Lenox Avenue like a king surveying his kingdom. And he didn't just flaunt his wealth. He flaunted his immunity. Between 1973 and 1977, he was arrested 13 different times for everything from homicide to bribery to drug possession, and walked away every single time, never convicted. That streak earned him the nickname that would stick, Mr. Untouchable.
Between 1973 and 77, Barnes was arrested variously for homicide, bribery, drug dealing, and gun possession, but none of the charges stuck.
He'd even toy with the cops, leading surveillance teams on high-speed joyrides just to make them sweat. To law enforcement, he was a nightmare. To himself, he was invincible, but invincibility had a body count. Between 1973 and 1979, the DEA estimated that more than 2,100 New Yorkers died from overdoses, most traced back to heroin supplied by Barnes's network. His business model was ruthless. Instead of paying his street dealers in cash, he paid them in. That way, their loyalty was never in question. They were hooked on the very product they sold. And as a former addict himself, Barnes prided himself on quality. His product came in bags marked with black duct tape, a personal brand. If you saw that tape, you knew it was strong, less diluted, exactly what junkies craved.
Between 1973 and 79, when Barnes operated, more than 2,100 people died in New York City alone from drug overdose. And according to the DEA, most of those deaths were caused by supplied by Barnes' organization. He paid his street sellers not in money, but in. And since many of them were addicts, that ensured an active and loyal sales force.
Still, Barnes wasn't all shadow. In the very neighborhoods he poisoned, he also played the role of community benefactor. He passed out turkeys on Thanksgiving, handed out toys at Christmas. He put money in the pockets of kids who ran errands. And for Harlem's youth, stuck in poverty with no way out, Nicky Barnes wasn't just another criminal. He was an idol. One black detective even admitted, kids in the ghetto think he's the greatest thing since Muhammad Ali. If there's one commandment in the world of organized crime, it's this: keep your mouth shut. The less people know about you, the longer you live free. The Italians lived by it. The Irish crews stuck to it. Even street-level hustlers understood it. But Nicky Barnes wasn't built like that. Money alone wasn't enough for him. He wanted the spotlight. By the mid-70s, Harlem already saw him as larger than life. He had the clothes, the cars, the crews, the reputation. He had beaten case after case, and with each escape, his confidence grew. That arrogance, that supreme self-belief, would push him into making the kind of decision that even veteran gangsters would shake their heads at. It all started in 1977. A reporter named Fred Ferretti from the New York Times was digging deep into Harlem's trade. The paper was preparing a feature on Barnes, Harlem's most elusive kingpin, and they weren't going to pull any punches. Editors reached out to his lawyer, David Breitbart, with a choice. They already had an old mugshot of Barnes. If Barnes didn't cooperate, that mugshot was going straight on the cover. Now, anybody who knew Nicky knew he hated mugshots. He wasn't about to let the world see him as just another busted junkie or thug. If this story was going to run, he wanted to control the image, so he agreed to pose. But not as a criminal. He wanted to look like what he called a sidewalk executive, Harlem's version of a CEO. The shoot itself was calculated down to the details. He picked a sharp blue denim suit, clean and fitted, something that said style and status at the same time. But his lawyer had one more suggestion: top it off with a red, white, and blue tie, something that a juror sitting in a courtroom might see and think, this man can't be all bad. It was a costume, really, a performance for the cameras, and Nicky played the part flawlessly. When the magazine hit newsstands on June 5th, 1977, it was a bombshell. The headline across the top was a name that would stick with him forever: Mr. Untouchable.
But in 1977, Barnes, who had been arrested 13 times on various charges but never convicted, was indicted once again. What was his reaction to this latest indictment? He posed for the cover of the New York Times Sunday magazine. They called him Mr. Untouchable.
And just to twist the knife, the sub-headline challenged the entire American justice system. The police say he He may be Harlem's biggest drug dealer, but can they prove it? For Harlem, it was validation, but to the feds, to the White House, it was a declaration of war. That Sunday morning, among the readers flipping through the Times, was President Jimmy Carter himself. And Carter wasn't amused. Here was a man, a self-confessed drug dealer, looking smug on the cover of one of the most respected newspapers in America, mocking law enforcement in broad daylight. Carter reportedly picked up the phone and called his Attorney General, Griffin Bell, furious. Bell, in turn, relayed the urgency to prosecutors. One of them was U.S. Attorney Bob Fisk, who remembered the pressure vividly. "I got a call on Monday morning from Griffin Bell. He told me the president had read the article and said the case against Barnes was now the most important case in his administration. It was a test of whether the justice system in America really worked."
The former U.S. Attorney from New York who prosecuted Barnes was Bob Fisk.
I got a call on Monday morning after the Sunday in which that article appeared from Griffin Bell,
The Attorney
the
General.
Attorney General, who told me that the president had read the article and had told Attorney General Bell that he felt that the case we had against Barnes in the Southern District of New York was the most important case in his administration.
From that point forward, the message was clear. Barnes wasn't just Harlem's problem anymore. He was America's. The White House itself wanted him buried under the prison. Even Rudy Giuliani, then a young federal prosecutor, got involved. The feds had their marching orders, and they weren't going to stop until they broke Mr. Untouchable. Journalist Pete Hamill put it best later: "You can't have the Times write about you if you're a gangster and expect to get away with anything. Successful gangsters cannot be known." But Barnes didn't believe that. He thought the cover was his coronation, his crowning moment, the proof that he was everything he said he was. In reality, it was the exact opposite. That glossy magazine spread didn't make him immortal. It painted the bullseye on his back bigger than ever. So now, the full weight of the United States Justice Department was now locked in on one target: Leroy Nicholas Barnes. The feds had already been on him for years, tracking his every move, flipping his people, setting up surveillance. But now, with the president breathing down their necks, failure wasn't an option. U.S. Attorney Robert B. Fisk Jr. stepped up to lead the charge. They had already planted undercover agents inside his world, guys like DEA agent Luis Diaz, who risked his life to infiltrate Barnes's network and collect evidence piece by piece. Wiretaps, surveillance, flipped informants. Slowly, the feds built a mountain of evidence that even Mr. Untouchable couldn't wiggle out of. The trial kicked off on September 29, 1977, and it was historic before the first witness even took the stand. Barnes had a reputation for tampering with jurors, leaning on witnesses, intimidating anyone who stood in his way. So the judge, Henry Worker, made a groundbreaking call. For the first time in U.S. history, a trial would be held with an anonymous jury. No names, no addresses, not even occupations, total secrecy. It was the only way to protect them from Barnes's reach. The press called it radical. Today, it's standard for mob bosses and cartel leaders. But back then, it was unheard of. For 2 long months, the courtroom was packed with testimony, wiretap recordings, and informants who painted a picture of Barnes's empire. The prosecution came with receipts, mountains of evidence showing just how wide his network stretched and how much death and destruction it left behind. Barnes, who had stared down juries before and always won, this time couldn't bluff his way out. On December 2nd, 1977, the verdict came down. Barnes was found guilty of running a continuing criminal enterprise. But not everyone went down with him. His protege, Guy Fisher, caught a lucky break. The jury couldn't reach a decision on his case, so he walked free. Years later, word would leak out. Fisher had bribed one of the jurors. Even in a courtroom that was supposedly locked tight, the streets still had a way of slipping in. On January 19th, 1978, Judge Worker handed down the sentence: life in prison, no chance of parole. They shipped him off to Marion Federal Penitentiary in Illinois. one of the toughest lockups in the country. Barnes went in trying to carry himself like a soldier. He even spent 7 months in solitary and never cracked. He wasn't about to give the feds the satisfaction of watching him fold. But while he was locked up, his empire was falling apart. The council started to unravel. Without his leadership, the business was sloppy, money was being wasted, bad was bought, profits dried up, and worst of all, they stopped paying his lawyers. That was Barnes's first clue that the loyalty he thought was unshakable was crumbling fast. Then came the real betrayal, the one that lit the fire of vengeance inside him. From behind bars, word trickled in about what his so-called brothers were doing on the outside. First, it was his wife, Thelma Grant. Barnes got word that she was sleeping with another dealer named Tito Johnson. If that wasn't bad enough, the streets made sure Barnes heard the details. Tito was spotted cruising through Harlem in Barnes's own white Mercedes. Thelma riding shotgun like it was her man's car now.
He said, Tito called me to the car because he wanted me to see that he had your woman. Tito was driving my cars. Oh, he never had a foreign car. He was a Buick Oldsmobile man.
And that began to eat on you.
Yeah.
And that eventually led to that call to Bill Tendy.
Yeah.
But the deepest cut came from the man Barnes once considered family, his protege, Guy Fisher. Fisher wasn't just some street hustler to Barnes. He was the future. But instead of loyalty, Fisher went behind his back and started an affair with Barnes's favorite mistress, Beverly Shemeka Ash. And he didn't even keep it discreet. Barnes heard stories of Fisher taking Shemeka to the Apollo Theater, the same Apollo that Fisher bought with Barnes's money, sitting up in the balcony for everyone to see. It wasn't just personal betrayal. It was a violation of the council's sacred code. In his mind, the code was dead. The brotherhood was a lie. And if loyalty was gone, then there was no reason to keep protecting anyone. By 1982, his rage had curdled into cold revenge. From his prison cell in Terre Haute, Indiana, Barnes picked up the phone and called U.S. Attorney William Tendy. Mr. Untouchable was ready to talk. Tendy wasn't expecting to hear from Barnes. This was the same man who once laughed in the face of the law, who treated prosecutors like pawns. But Barnes wasn't calling to beg. He was calling to declare war on the very people he once called family. When Tendy asked him why Harlem's kingpin would suddenly want to cooperate with the very system he hated, Barnes gave it to him straight. They were friends of mine. They were supposed to be doing things for me, you know? And they're doing things against me, really. And I have no way to reach out to get to them, and I want to get back at them. That's my primary reason.
They were public friends of mine that were supposed to be doing things for me, you know?
Yeah.
And well, they're doing things against me, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no way to reach out to get to them, and I want to get back at them, really.
Mm-hmm.
That's my primary reason.
He handed over a list of 109 names, everybody from his closest partners to mid-level players, suppliers, crooked associates, even his own wife, Thelma Grant. One by one, he laid out the map of his old empire for the feds. Over the next year, he didn't just give them names. He actively helped them set up stings, arranged controlled buys, and fed the DEA the very people who once swore loyalty to him. But once the news of his cooperation leaked in October 1982, the streets struck back. Word spread fast that Mr. Untouchable had flipped. And if there's one thing more dangerous than a drug lord, it's a drug lord turned snitch. Barnes's old ties to the Italian mob, which once gave him protection and supply, now turned against him. A Gambino associate named Mark Reeder, who had supplied heroin to the council, felt Barnes's testimony was a direct threat. He worried that Barnes's old mistress, Beverly Shemeka Ash, and her brother Steve might connect him to the case. Reeder decided to send a message. Barnes might be safe behind bars, but the people close to him weren't. On the night of December 13th, 1982, Shemeka was sitting in the Monarch Bar up in Sugar Hill. She was 27, out on $50,000 bail, and living with the constant fear of what might come next. That fear came to life when a man walked in wearing a white mask. his shoulders hunched to hide his build. He pulled a .45 caliber pistol, walked straight up to her, and shot her 3 times in the head and neck. She died instantly. The shooter was Raymond Clark, a co-conspirator who later bragged that he wore the mask so witnesses would think he was white. Shemeka's murder was retaliation, a warning shot aimed directly at Barnes's soul. She died because of him. But if the mob thought this would scare Barnes into silence, they were dead wrong. He didn't fold. When the time came, he took the stand. And in open court, the man who had built his empire on loyalty now dismantled it piece by piece. It was a surreal sight. Nicky Barnes, the man in the custom suits and shades, now stood in a courtroom, calmly dismantling his old empire. He pointed across the room and named names: Guy Fisher, Frank James, Wallace Rice, Ishmael Muhammad, men who had once been his brothers. He broke down their operations in detail, how the moved, how the money was cleaned, who ordered hits, who gave payoffs. Judge Milton Pollock would later call his testimony compelling, devastating, and truly shocking. But beneath the cold delivery, there were cracks of emotion. Barnes himself admitted later, "I was overwhelmed by guilt. I had every reason to testify against them, and no reason at all to feel guilty. But it's that street corner indoctrination, that criminal ethic, that street corner value system. It's overpowering, and I started crying on the stand." His testimony was lethal. The trials ended with the conviction of every major council member, life sentences without parole. By 1983, the council was finished, dead. Its leaders would spend the rest of their lives behind bars.
How important was the information
I think it was terribly important.
in that?
I think it was terribly important because it resulted in the conviction of Barnes's, the hard core of Barnes' entire operation.
And Barnes didn't stop there. Over the next decade, he kept feeding the government case after case, helping convict nearly 50 more dealers tied to his old network. Prisons from coast to coast started filling with men who were there because of him. At one point, Lewisburg Penitentiary had a section nicknamed the Nicky Barnes Range because it was packed with inmates he'd testified against. By the late 90s, Nicky Barnes had gone from Harlem's untouchable kingpin to the government's most prized witness. For that, the system he once mocked decided to reward him. Prosecutors, among them a hard-charging young U.S. attorney out of New York named Rudolph Giuliani, stood in court and sang his praises. Not long before, they had called him the scum of the earth. Now he was their star player, their Robin Hood in reverse, turning in names instead of stealing from the rich. And their arguments worked. In August of 1998, after 21 years behind bars, Leroy Nicky Barnes walked out of prison at 64 years old. But he wasn't really free, not in the way he used to be. He could never be Nicky Barnes again. Harlem's Mr. Untouchable was officially dead. What stepped out of those prison gates was a man reborn under a new name, a new identity, and a new life. The government tucked him into the Federal Witness Protection Program because by then there was a $1 million bounty on his head. They gave him a new name, Clayton Clay Williams, and shipped him off to an undisclosed location that later came to light as Minneapolis, Minnesota. Life as Clay Williams couldn't have been more different. No more spotlight, no more silk shirts and gaiters. He was just another aging man in baggy jeans, blending into a mostly white neighborhood. He clocked in 40-hour weeks like everybody else. One of his jobs was at Walmart, and the irony was that he reportedly complained about the store's sales and distribution system, telling people he could run it better, which of course he could. The man had once run a global drug syndicate with Fortune 500 level precision. Now, he was stuck watching managers bungle shelf space. He drove a used car. He went ice fishing. He started eating healthier. But Barnes wasn't built to disappear completely. In 2007, nearly a decade after he got out, he briefly came out of hiding. His face was blurred, his voice sometimes distorted, but he stepped in front of the cameras for a documentary and a memoir. both titled Mr. Untouchable. But that decision came with a price. Once he revealed himself, the U.S. Marshals officially cut him loose from witness protection. Though he was still on parole, he didn't seem to care. In an interview, he explained it plainly. Nicky Barnes is not around anymore. Nicky Barnes's lifestyle and his value system is extinct. I left Nicky Barnes behind. I'm not looking in the rearview mirror to see if anyone is tailing me anymore. I don't turn on the blender when I'm at home so I can talk. That is not a part of my life. For him, that was the closure. He had killed the myth of Mr. Untouchable and buried it himself. The actual end of his life came quietly. Barnes was diagnosed with cancer, and in 2012, at the age of 78 or 79, he died. No funeral, no headlines, no obituary for Nicky Barnes. He was living under an assumed identity, so on paper, the man simply vanished. For 7 years, the world didn't even know he was gone. His death wasn't revealed until 2019, when reporters covering the passing of his old rival Frank Lucas started asking what happened to Nicky Barnes. That's when the truth slipped out. His daughter confirmed it, explaining the family's decision to keep it private, and that's how it ended. But his legacy is harder to bury. It's messy, complicated, and unforgettable. Barnes was a criminal genius who helped revolutionize the drug trade in New York. Even the men he destroyed found ways to carve out legacies of their own. Guy Fisher, the protege Barnes personally sent away, turned his prison sentence into a path of redemption. While locked up, Fisher earned not 1 but 4 degrees, finishing with a PhD in sociology. In October 2020, after 38 years behind bars, he was released on compassionate grounds. Unlike Barnes, Fisher re-emerged with the air of a man transformed, not a man hiding. In the end, the man who once craved the spotlight more than anything ended up disappearing into the shadows.